Well, thank you for coming inside on this beautiful, beautiful night to have this conversation, because it's conversations like this that are getting me through right now. So being in community, being in conversation with all of you is what gives me hope here. Over the last couple years, we started Mapping Prejudice in 2016. I've given dozens of presentations about Mapping Prejudice, and the project really started as an experiment. We didn't know exactly what we were doing or where we were going. We didn't even know that whether we could make a complete data set of these racial restrictions that I'm going to talk about. I put one of them up on the screen here that you can see. But as our data set got bigger, as our project got more developed, and as my understanding of the history of housing discrimination got more fleshed out, I would say that my message got sharper. That I can boil it down to this. So that we have the highest racial disparities in the country here in the Twin Cities. This is unjust, it's immoral for all kinds of reasons, but it's also unsustainable. This is gonna rip our community apart. It affects everybody in this community. Then, of course, as you know, on the evening of May 25th, George Floyd was murdered. He was murdered on at this corner in South Minneapolis, 38th and Chicago. And from this corner, demonstrations and civil unrest spread first through the city, and then around the country, and then around the world. So what began here has mushroomed into what scholars are now calling the largest protest movement in American history. Over the summer, 25 million Americans took to the streets in support of Black Lives Matter. So in the wake of all these events, Mapping Prejudice, my little team, we found ourselves at the center of something of a maelstrom. People were calling us from all over the world to try to figure out why this all started in Minneapolis. So of course, that's going to be a question that we're all going to be talking about for decades to come. And my team can really speak to one piece of it, which is the history of racial covenants, and what I have come to see as the woeful amnesia around this history of discriminatory housing practices in the Twin Cities. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I want to start with some statistics. The Twin Cities have the highest gap between white homeownership rates and Black homeownership rates for any community, for any major metropolitan area in the country. For white households, our rates of home are actually much higher than the national average. For Black families, our rates of homeownership are actually much lower than the national average. So 75% of white families own their own home. Only 23% of Black families can make that same claim. And this homeownership rate is significant. The gap is really significant for a lot of reasons, namely that housing undergirds all these other racial disparities that you hear so much about in the Twin Cities. So the more I study housing, the more I'm convinced that it's the foundation of all these other inequities. Your housing really determines whether you're healthy or whether you're sick. It determines what kind of access to education you have, whether your family will be able to have stability, whether you'll be able to amass wealth, whether you'll be able to pass that wealth to the next generation. So since 2016, my team has been pursuing a question: how did we get here? If Minnesota is such a great place to live, how did we get such a huge gap in such a critical area? What did we do wrong? And of course, what can we do better in the future? So our team came together out of a desire to show one thing to as many people as possible. That is that these contemporary racial disparities that I've put up here on the screen, they're not natural. They're not there's nothing inevitable about these kinds of statistics. And we've been doing this by leading community members in the construction of a map that illuminates how real estate developers in particular used racial covenants to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people. So I'll pause for a definition. Racial covenants, they're clauses, they're legal clauses that were inserted into property deeds. And here in the Twin Cities, real estate developers started using them in 1910. This up here is the first deed that has this, that we found that had this kind of restriction. This deed is from 1910. And it says, the party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. So these clauses were attached to new land that was being developed to keep people who were named in, in this clause from neither buying nor even occupying the land. The language, we found a huge variety of language, but it's always racist. So I'm going to read you a couple more examples, but I want you to be prepared. It's upsetting to hear this. No person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. No person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or a tenant. So in every presentation that I do, I read these deeds aloud. I read this language aloud because we want to name race. We want to name racism. We want to avoid doing what a lot of Americans have done, which is treating race and racism with euphemism, with evasion. So I think it's important, first of all, to just confront the fact that racism will not disappear if we ignore it. That if we want justice, we really have to confront this hard history and confront this truth. But it's hard, it's hard to hear. So if you look at the history of housing, this question of racial covenants jumps out. You can see they're so outrageous, they're so blatantly racist, and they were used in every community across the country. In fact, by the 1930s, the federal government was actually making their use a precondition for public underwriting of development. Racial covenants are not secret in any way. They've been the subject of dozens of books and plays and poems and artwork. They were the target of a several decade-long legal campaign by the NAACP that ended up at the US Supreme Court. But even with all of that attention, with all of those books, all of those articles, there's a lot that we don't know about these restrictions. In our quest to figure out how we got here, my team wanted to know some things like, what did these covenants actually say? What was the language? Where were they used? How common were they? How much land did they actually cover? And we decided to do this research in an unconventional way by turning to community members like you to help us build the first ever comprehensive map of racial covenants for an American city. So what our project has been doing is leading people of all ages and all backgrounds in the work of mapping these restrictions. What we did is we used computers to comb through millions of property records at Hennepin County, the Hennepin County Recorder's Office, to flag the documents that seem to have this racist language. So for our Hennepin County map, we had 3,000 volunteers who read 177,000 historic property deeds and found 24,000 property parcels that had this kind of racist language. So here's what they did. Here's the product of all that labor. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing the spread of racial covenants throughout Hennepin County over time. The top right-hand corner is the time lapse, it tells you the year and tells you the number of covenants. But each one of these blue dots that's expanding on the map shows an area that we've identified as being covered with one of these racial covenants. So nobody has ever created a comprehensive map of this kind before for any American community. And I'm very proud to say that we've done it, we've built it in collaboration with community, and we found it to be a really powerful platform for policymaking, for research, and the kind of conversation that we're having here tonight. So I always start these presentations by reading a covenant so you can see exactly what we're talking about, what this language is. Then I showed this map to show that these are not unusual or isolated examples, that there's thousands and thousands of them. They cover large swaths of land. But it's also important for you to understand how powerful these documents were. They weren't trivial restrictions. So covenants did something, they ran with the land, which meant that they were there forever once they were put into place. Once they were embedded into the deeds, it didn't matter how many times the land changed hands or what was built, what was torn down. These restrictions remained. So, and anyone who chose to try to ignore one of these covenants, sell a piece of land to someone who is named in one of these restrictions, they risk losing everything, ending up in court, losing all the equity that they had accumulated in the property. But the fact of the matter is, the painful truth about that is that didn't happen very often. And the reason it didn't happen very often is that most white people felt like these restrictions were they were positive, that they were good things, that they were very supportive of these. And Black people, by contrast, saw covenants as a threat to basic liberty. And here in the Twin Cities, we had leaders like Nellie Francis, Madison Jackson, Lena Olive Smith, James Wardlaw, Katie McWatt, I'm just naming a few, who devoted their lives to fighting these practices. And they weren't alone. It was all over the country. You have Black people who put everything on the line to challenge them. They bought houses with covenants. They moved into white neighborhoods. That's what Arthur and Edith Lee did in 1931 when they bought a tiny white bungalow in South Minneapolis. It was on the corner of 46th and Columbus. And after they moved into this house with their young daughter, Mary, who's in this picture right here, they found themselves under attack. Even before they moved in, neighbors had approached them and begged them to consider not moving in, to sell their house, to sell their house back to neighbors. These neighbors called the realtor, they called the bank, they called their city council members, they called the police. And the Lees said, no, we want to live in this house. We feel that we have a right to establish a home. And once they moved in, a mob formed around the house. This was in July of 1931, and they stayed there all summer long, threatening the family, throwing things through the windows, threatening to burn the house down. You can see behind Mary and Edith in this picture, the black paint that was spattered on their white house. You can see the broken window behind them. And the house still stands today at 46th and Columbus. And in fact, there's a historic marker outside of the house. But the reason that it's still there today is because Arthur Lee worked at the post office downtown. He was also a World War I veteran. And he was able to draw on his colleagues who formed an armed perimeter around the house to protect him and protect his family, though they had to live in the basement because people were constantly throwing things through the windows. Little Mary was just starting kindergarten right after they moved into this house. She had to have a police escort to get to kindergarten every day. One day when she was at school, someone killed her dog. She came home to find her dog dead. So the Lee house did not have a covenant. It was right on the edge of a neighborhood that was covered with covenants. But the proliferation of these covenants really normalized the ideas that led to this ongoing attack on the Lees. According to the logic of these covenants, the Lees posed a threat to their neighbors. So this was at a moment at the beginning of the Great Depression when 1/3 of the population was out of work, and people were terrified of losing everything that all the money that and the security that they had accumulated in their homes. So as these racial boundaries hardened in American cities, this threat, this kind of white violence, was always present. And this was one of the main ways that covenants were enforced. Folks didn't bother going to court. They just called together a mob like this. So covenants are illegal today. They were made illegal through a series of court decisions, starting with Shelley v. Kramer, and laws that ended with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And a lot of times when people have told the story of these housing restrictions, they've ended with that very, very important law, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But unfortunately, the story doesn't end there because we're still living with the legacies of these practices. So what did covenants do? Our research has shown that they transformed a relatively mixed city into a really segregated city. Covenants emboldened white Minneapolitans to harass their Black neighbors like the Lees. Black residents were pushed into a couple of small neighborhoods in Minneapolis. And as new neighborhoods came online, they were restricted with these covenants. Those neighborhoods that had a lot of covenants in them, they're still the whitest neighborhoods in Minneapolis today, in the Twin Cities. The neighborhoods that didn't have covenants, they were redlined. That was the federal practice that declared neighborhoods that were racially mixed to be hazardous investments for lenders. This choked off capital to these areas. So these two things, covenants and then redlining, worked to make it really hard for people who are not white to find stable, affordable, decent housing. It made it really hard for people who were not white to buy homes. So this is important for all kinds of reasons. We know that obviously in this pandemic, it's driven the importance of home to all of us, right? As we're sitting in our homes, listening, for me speaking to you, for you listening to me. But home ownership is a critical avenue for wealth accumulation, especially in the United States. So this story that I'm telling about racial covenants, about white violence, about redlining, it's in no way unique to Minneapolis. This urban reshuffling, this segregation by race was happening in every community across the country. So across the nation at this moment, Blacks, in the words of the poet Langston Hughes, were hemmed in. So that's the title of a poem that he wrote in 1949 about Chicago, where he said, "They've got covenants restricting me, hemmed in on the South Side, can't breathe free." 71 years later, Black people are still struggling to breathe in Minneapolis and in other cities across the country. So please, 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 I can't breathe. That's what George Floyd pleaded as in his last moments before he died. So the death of Mr. Floyd grows out of this structural racism that's so entrenched in Minneapolis today. So this history for me is in no way an academic exercise, despite all the research that we've done. It's very personal to me. So I'm a third generation Minneapolitan, and at the same time that folks in South Minneapolis were terrorizing people like the Lees and other Black families, my grandparents were being welcomed to the city. So my grandparents were from immigrant families with roots in Sweden. They started their lives with very little money and little formal schooling. Two of my grandparents were actually orphaned at really young ages. None of them made it past the 8th grade. But like a lot of immigrants, what they had was a capacity for hard work. So my grandparents worked as farm laborers. They worked as lumberjacks. They worked as domestic servants. They worked as carpenters. They tried homesteading in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Montana, North Dakota. And then they decided to come to the big city thinking that they would find more opportunity. And they were right. During the Great Depression, my grandparents built businesses. They saved their money. They got married. And in 1942, both sets of my grandparents were able to buy houses in Minneapolis. This was such a huge deal for my father's parents. My father is he's the little guy in the front there with the bib overalls on. That my grandfather actually hired a film crew to record the housewarming party, where they invited everyone they had ever known to come and celebrate their good fortune. My uncle had this film digitized. It's up on YouTube. It goes on for 2.5 hours, where they recorded everyone coming in their best clothes, pulling up to the house, walking around the house, celebrating this happy moment. And you can just see from this film footage what a huge, huge deal it was for my family to become property owners, to become homeowners. But thanks to our map, I now know that this house had a racial covenant on it. So that black icon in the upper right-hand corner of this map, that's my grandparents' house. The red is the covenants. So it's located, my mother's family lived nearby. It's the same story. Their block was also covered with racial covenants. So although my grandparents were new arrivals to this country, they were regarded as white. So that meant that they could build their lives in a part of the city that was off limits to other Minneapolitans who had the same levels of education, the same levels of income as my grandparents did. And I grew up visiting my grandparents' houses near Lake Nokomis. I certainly heard so many stories about what it was like for my parents growing up in this neighborhood. My parents really described it as just a wonderful place to be a kid in the 1940s and the 1950s. Their moms kicked them out of the house first thing in the morning. They were able to swim in the lake, explore the creek, skate during the winter, walk to school, and without any concern for their safety, right? And really importantly for my family, the neighborhood had really solid schools. Both of my parents went to college. My mother went to graduate school. So their parents had, my mother's parents had gone to, not made it past 5th grade. So, but all of this was only for white people. So my parents said that they never questioned why their neighborhood, why their neighbors were all Swedish and Norwegian and German. This uniform whiteness seemed to them to be entirely natural. Even at this moment in time where we know that the number of Black people are really increasing in Minneapolis. And here's the other important thing about the timing. My grandparents bought their houses in this neighborhood just as the United States was about to see the largest expansion of the middle class in its history. So much of that prosperity rested on homeownership, which had been deliberately supported by new federal programs in the 1930s. But these new federal programs introduced redlining as well as the modern mortgage. And these discriminatory policies meant that 98% of FHA loans made between 1934 and 1962 went to white people, 98%. So what does that mean? It means that these programs were created to benefit people like my grandparents. And like the GI Bill, they excluded people who were not white. So 2 generations later, I'm still benefiting from the fact that my grandparents were able to buy houses in a part of the city where property values increased for most of the 20th century. Our research shows that today, 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, houses in Minneapolis that had covenants, like the one owned by my grandparents, are worth 15% more than the identical houses that did not have covenants. And my grandparents were able to pass on this additional value to me. When my grandfather died, my family sold his house and distributed the profits to all the grandchildren. Most of us, including me, used that money to put a down payment on a house, a home of their own. That's what I did. I was able to buy a house in a part of South Minneapolis where I couldn't have afforded it without that help. And I was looking basically to replicate all the advantages that my parents talked about from their childhood. I wanted my kids to have easy access to the chain of lakes. I wanted my kids to have solid schools. So I know I'm extremely fortunate, but I'm not unusual in this regard. So in 2019, the National Association of Realtors found that 30% of first-time home buyers got the same kind of help from their family to manage the purchase of a home. So like a lot of my peers, I leveraged the economic security of earlier generations to secure the future of my children. And my kids are benefiting in so many ways from it today. They love to hear this, of course. My kids love to hear about all the advantages that I have given them. But they also hear about, because I'm a historian, I talk all the time about how the opportunities that they have today were shaped by the opportunities that my grandparents were given. That I tell them all the time that we carry our history with us, all of us do. None of us are unencumbered by what came before. And I want everyone, not just my kids, that's why I do this work, I want everyone to see this. That's what this map that we're creating is meant to convey. And as we've shared it with people, we've discovered that it helps people to see structural racism. And when I say structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that's backed by legal authority and institutional control. So racial covenants, these racial covenants that we're talking about, they're classic manifestations of structural racism. Racism is not just a matter of how I feel or my personal bias. It's not just the sentiments of people like these protesters against the Minnesota Fair Housing Act of 1962 who were holding up these picket signs. You know, their sentiments are clear. Mapping Prejudice is trying to get people to look beyond that kind of racism, to understand that this racist ideology has been written into our foundational documents of our community. So that, you know, structural racism undergirds all of our community maps in so many ways. It sorts people into zones of privilege and dispossession, and it means that even people who live next to each other are sent on entirely different trajectories in their lives. So why is this history important today? It helps us to understand why today it seems to be the same group of people who are vulnerable to housing insecurity. And this housing insecurity, of course, ripples into every other aspect of life to affect your health, your educational opportunities, your job prospects. And structural racism undergirds a system that was built to keep Black and brown people from owning property. I mean, that was the explicit design of the system. It was designed to keep Black bodies out of places that were seen as desirable. It was designed to keep Black and brown bodies out of the spaces that I was taught as a kid growing up in Minneapolis that belonged to all of us. So what do we do now? That's the question. I think we have no choice, but we have to make amends for this history. We have to make amends for the damages that we have, that have been done. And so my piece of this is that I am helping people remember what has been deliberately forgotten. That's a first step towards justice, but we all have to move from that awareness into some action. So here's a place you can start. You can help us document this history. We're working on a map of Ramsey County, and we need volunteers. We do virtual volunteer sessions once a week. And my very skilled colleagues can walk you through what's involved. It's important to do this work, not just because we need your labor, but because we want you to read these primary sources and then share what you learn with your friends, your family members, your the people in your congregation here, and your elected officials, of course. It's up to all of us to make sure that this awareness translates into action. We need to avoid, I would say, a very common mistake of the past, which was to see awareness as enough. Like, that's enough now that I know about this history, and to stop there. So, what should we do? The great news is that there are just so many very powerful, well-organized groups in Minnesota working on housing justice, working on racial justice. I'm going to point to two. The Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity has just an excellent agenda online for both volunteer work, but also for policy work. Some very clear policy actions that you can support to support affordable housing, to increase Black home ownership rates. I always like to point to this equity in place policy agenda, because this is a group of organizations that's controlled by people who are not white. And I think that's a really important group to look to, because they are the people who've been most affected by these policies over time. They're at the front lines, and they have a really good sense of what they need for justice. So, I mean, the reality is that these solutions will cost money. We need to invest in housing, we need to invest in schools, in neighborhoods and people. But I think we've seen over the summer what the alternatives are. So, and it's important for us to understand that it goes beyond money. It's also, this is an opportunity for us as a community for a collective moral reckoning, a moral awakening. And what I get out of this work is I love being part of the people, being in community with people who want to be part of this renewal. And that's why I'm very happy to be here tonight with you. And I'm eager to hear your questions. So with that, I'd love to open it up.
Yeah, folks can feel free to unmute their mic. You can type in the chat, whatever is comfortable for you.
In the covenants, it listed Asians as well as Blacks. Why does it feel to me like the Black community has been impacted more than the Asian community?
That's a really excellent question. I think it has to do with timing. For one thing, that the Asian community in the Twin Cities was tiny here until the 1980s, really, the 1970s and 1980s. So Asian families moved here en masse right at the moment where all those racial barriers really did come down. So there was just a lot more. And what you can see in the history is that property ownership it's like a snowball effect. What people do is they tend to, if one family acquires property, you see again and again that they help other families in their network also acquire property. So, so what our research has shown in the early 20th century that there were a lot of Black property owners in South Minneapolis who were very systematically shut down. They lost their property because of this sort of this increasing violence and pressure from these covenants and all these other policies. So I think it was a matter of timing when the different populations grew in the Twin Cities.
Can you share your data with others? Do you have that in a public location?
We do. We actually, so I'm at the University of Minnesota libraries, and my colleagues are just uploading our like official public data set to our, it's called DRUM. It's the data repository for the University of Minnesota. Yeah, so we have shared our data very widely, even before it's been public. the official data set was public. But yeah, if you're interested, please get in touch and we'd be happy to share.
And you can also, while you were talking, I pulled up the Mapping Prejudice website, and I've got right around the church, there are a few neighborhoods that have some covenants in them right close. So Carson, if you wanted to look online, I dropped mappingprejudice.umn.edu in the chat. You can click on there.
Yeah, that'd be great, because I'd like to get into the underlying data, because I do a lot of healthcare analysis and to kind of see how that ties into it.
I thank you for sharing that. What we found, I'm trained as a historian, and what has been most revelatory for me about doing this work, I was not a data set person, but when we started sharing early renditions of our map, we were approached by people like you who do this kind of data set analysis. And one of the first women who approached us is a woman named Rachel Hardiman, who is one of the experts in health racial disparities at the University of Minnesota. And she said, I saw your map, I studied maternal mortality rates, and I can tell you that your map tracks my research perfectly. And what we've heard since that first encounter, that first conversation we had with Rachel Hardiman, is what one person said to us is it's all the same map. It doesn't matter what it is that you're studying, whether you're studying asthma rates or maternal mortality rates or employment rates or crime rates or tree cover. That was the one that really expanded my thinking, that covenants determined where trees were planted in cities. And so the implications of that for today is that neighborhoods that didn't have covenants in Minneapolis are in the summer on average 10 degrees warmer than neighborhoods that did have covenants. And those heightened heat, the heat index being so much higher in the summer leads to a whole host of other health problems for the people who live in those neighborhoods. National Geographic just used our data and did an analysis that illuminates those sort of racial justice, environmental justice aspects of this data. So it's really like the base for every other inequality and injustice that people have been able to identify.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of highlight on that. So a couple of things is I work in the private sector with United Health Group, and they do a lot of work with social determinants of health.
Yes.
So you'd see a lot of correlation there. And then also on the side, I work with our United Health Foundation. So I kind of want to see if there's some opportunities to share data with them.
We would love, yeah, definitely send me an email and I can connect you up with anything. We were really lucky to have a group of volunteers from United Health early on who helped us with some of our data cleaning protocols and scripts. So again, like you put things out there, it's amazing. It's amazing how people help you and come together around things.
Thank you.
The time-lapse map that you put together and showed at the beginning of the talk, do you have a similar time-lapse map that compares three things: the covenant-containing areas, areas that didn't have covenants, and areas that were undeveloped?
So I'm not sure. So the covenant, so the time-lapse shows, I mean, you're right. You've focused in on something that's really important, like how much of this land was developed and how much was not developed, right? Is that kind of your question?
That, and then in addition, for any one period of time, what proportion of land was being covenanted or not? At the very beginning, I'd expect, since they weren't so common, that it was a small amount. And if you looked at it, it's probably a bell-shaped curve. At some point, there was a peak where nearly all of it, or maybe a high proportion, was.
Yep.
And then toward the end, you'd end up with, as the laws and so forth, going back down to zero.
Right. That's exactly what we found. So this practice starts in 1910. It takes a little bit of time to take off and become really, but by by 1930, it's ubiquitous. Any new development that's coming online, any new development that's platted is racially covenanted. And that's why you see the pattern that you do. And the placement of racial covenants are correlates exactly to the time period that areas were developed. So that led to some surprises for us, because we expected that it would correlate perfectly with income, for instance, and it doesn't. You have a neighborhood like Kenwood, which was developed before covenants were used, and there are no covenants in Kenwood. And then there are other neighborhoods that are very wealthy today that were developed after covenants were made illegal. And they, so they also don't. So people always ask us, what's the significance of this donut-shaped development, or placement of covenants? And it has entirely to do with when different areas were developed. But one thing that people are always curious about is this kind of data, this hard data, this map really does, give lie to some pretty entrenched ideas that people have about their community. So for instance, in St. Louis Park, so many people in St. Louis Park have this narrative about St. Louis Park that St. Louis Park was this very welcoming community. It's always been a very, the biggest proponent of this idea is Tom Friedman, who always talks about St. Louis Park. He always says that, it was the only place that, Jews were really welcome, and it's because it didn't have racial covenants. Well, our map shows that St. Louis Park is covered with racial covenants, and it's just not true. Like once you look at the data. So Edina is also covered with racial covenants. Hopkins it's a little more patchy, in part because there's a lot more industrial land in Hopkins than in some of these other first-ring suburbs.
In places like Hopkins, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just have a question, because living in St. Louis Park, so I thought that there was something where even the Jews could not live in certain places, and so a lot of people congregated here in St. Louis Park. Was that true?
They left Minneapolis and they came to St. Louis Park.
That's the very strong, oral memory, right? Yeah. And it's what we've found is it's a lot. The story is more complicated than that. That the neighborhood in North Minneapolis, where Jews were coming out of Minneapolis, did not have any racial covenants in it, and Jews moved from that neighborhood into St. Louis Park that was covered with racial covenants. And, and Jews were accepted in St. Louis Park as white. A lot of these covenants said only members of the Caucasian race can occupy this land. And that kind of phrase is always, as Jews are always seen as conditionally white. Jews don't always know whether they're going to be seen as white or not. But in St. Louis Park, it was interpreted to mean that Jews could live there.
But could they not live in other part, maybe where they came from? They didn't have a covenant, but how about other parts of Minneapolis? So would they be widely accepted within Minneapolis, or was it that they came here because it was more open to them?
Well, I think there's a lot of pieces to that. We have found there are Jewish sort of enclaves in South Minneapolis as well. I mean, obviously the big, Temple Israel is right in, South Minneapolis on Hennepin Avenue in a really prominent location. You have other temples in South Minneapolis in the same time. And the other piece of the history that we've excavated is that there's one of the developers who made these racial covenants very common. His name was Edmund Walton. When he published a covenant in the Minneapolis Tribune in 1919 that included a mention of Jews, the Jewish community organized and went to the state legislature and got the legislature to pass a law that made it illegal to discriminate in real estate transactions on the basis of religion. And so after that moment, after that 1919 law was passed, explicit mentions of Jews drop out of the covenants. And so actually when we did, so the 24,000 covenants that we found, less than 1% mentioned Jews. So, but but it's not to say that there wasn't anti-Semitism in housing, because anti-Semitism was very strong and very palpable, but it maybe took other forms, and it was a little bit more, it was a little more complicated. It's like who's considered Caucasian, who's not considered Caucasian, and also in the case of St. Louis Park, you have communities sort of moving en masse and settling around temples, that move out of North Minneapolis into St. Louis Park. So there's that kind of group migration, that happens in St. Louis Park.
I'd like a clarification on
No, it is. I just did.
on the GI Bill. You mentioned that it was written to help the white veterans more than the Black veterans. Is that, how did they do that? How did they exclude Black veterans in the GI Bill?
Just looking here for one of my books, I always like to hold up a book. If you, when I answer a question, have any of you read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law? I would highly recommend it for you. It's a great sort of overview of a lot of this material that I'm talking about. And he provides, I think, a pretty good explanation of the way this worked. So the GI Bill was race neutral language. But when Black veterans went to try to buy a home using the GI Bill, they were not allowed to, the federal government, as part of this regulatory structure that related to the GI Bill, would not let Black veterans buy in predominantly white neighborhoods. They would not support what they called the integration of neighborhoods, or the disruption of neighborhoods, the disruption of the racial character of neighborhoods. So that meant that, and there was a racial covenant, of course, a Black veteran couldn't buy a house. So Black GIs couldn't use it to buy into white neighborhoods. They couldn't use it to buy a house with a covenant. And then when they went to try to buy houses in neighborhoods like Rondo or the Old South Side neighborhoods, those neighborhoods were redlined. And what that meant is that banks would not extend loans for houses in those neighborhoods. It didn't matter whether it was a GI Bill or not. So there was just no place that people could exercise these, use these loans that were available to white veterans. And there's lots and lots of cases of Black veterans trying so hard to buy, to exercise, to take advantage of these loans and just being turned down.
I think your use of the word systematic is right, because I think about what it took to make this happen in what you described, who was involved. I mean, realtors, bankers, city officials, businesses probably. It really is about, systematic, and it took a lot of different people in powerful places to keep this in place. So it wasn't by accident. It wasn't a few people. It was what was working at the time for the people that were in that area that wanted to keep what they had going. So
I have a question. These covenants, are they recorded in the deed or something, or how do they?
Yep. Yeah, they're recorded in the deeds of property records. So in order to document, to create this data set to find where they were, you had to go through 10 million property deeds in Hennepin County. So that's why nobody, we have created the first ever map of this kind. No one has ever been able to do that before, because no one has ever been able to figure out how to use computers basically to do that heavy lifting. One of my colleagues did the calculation, and he figured out if if he just tried to go through the property records of Hennepin County looking for these deeds, it would have taken him 20 years, I guess, working 40 hours a week, just reading through. And that's the kind of the insidious nature of these. They're so, they're present everywhere, but actually finding them has been tricky.
So there are white people living in houses that they aren't aware of that because didn't affect them when they bought. But if they go to sell it, they might be surprised to find out they can't sell it to that person. Is that right?
Right. Yep. That's right.
Okay.
I mean, they're not legal today, just to be clear. The clauses are still in all of our property records, but they are not legally enforceable today.
Oh, okay. I thought I had heard that, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, that's really a really important point. But, I think it's important to recognize the fact that there's two laws that are sort of keeping these from being enforceable today. One is the Fair Housing Act, and the other is the Minnesota Fair Housing Act. I think it's important for all of us to understand that laws can be overturned by Congress, by the state legislature. And I think, that's one of the reasons that I think it's important for us to understand this history and understand that these clauses are in, 24,000 property records in Hennepin County, so that's a lot of land in Hennepin County that could potentially have this kind of racial restriction kick back into play if those laws went away.
I was just thinking about, we didn't get a financial gift to buy our home or anything, but we were kind of, I would say, mentored along life's way, with conversations and questions. And if that's a way that, like, if we, in our radar, we see somebody who's working and should be able to buy a house and just say, hey, I thought about buying a house. And you have some questions, I've, done it, and feel free to ask, or, help get people started in the process, because it's a process. To save up your down payment and then to start looking and all of that. And so mentoring people that might be ready for that or have the opportunity, but just don't understand it because it hasn't been part of life.
Or, or even helping people get their credit into the right place. And there's great programs, and I've had the good fortune in doing this work of meeting and working with a lot of people. Again, and Habitat for Humanity has a fantastic mentoring program for people. Everything from financial, credit scores to, you have to, before you buy a Habitat home, you have to know how to fix a toilet, which I can tell you would have been very helpful for me when I bought my first, very practical. Like, you can't, how do you do these basic things, right? Project for Pride in Living is another group that does that kind of financial counseling, mentoring. Also, the Minnesota Homeownership Center. So these are all organizations that are in our community that deserve our support. And deserve, this should be on your radar if you're at all interested in any of these issues. We should be supporting the good work, I guess, that's going on in our community today.
Just want to make a quick check. We are right at 7:30, so want to be respectful of everyone's time. Is there one last question? I wonder if if you have any, what's maybe the most positive thing that has come out of the research as you've put it out into the world that you can point to? What's the greatest impact it's had so far?
Well, I think just all the community building and the conversations about race that I think, especially in Minnesota, we find very frightening in a lot of ways. We've been very worried about having these conversations and saying the wrong thing. And we've had we've had literally thousands of people come to our sessions and have these, you know, courageous conversations around race and structures. And, you know, I really, really believe that we are at a watershed moment in our country, in our community. Not just, you know, the events of the pandemic and the unrest of the summer, but we're at a turning point in terms of. So I take hope and joy out of being with all of you and being in community and you know, drawing from your energy and your interest in trying to do the right thing going forward, I guess. So I can point to a lot of things. If you haven't seen Jim Crow of the North, that was a documentary that was inspired by Mapping Prejudice, where the team followed us for a year and sort of wove some of these archival stories together with our work. It's a wonderful documentary that I would highly recommend. And seeing that documentary, it's now been viewed close to more than 1 million times in classrooms across the state. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm proudest of, is seeing young people coming up and their just awareness of this history.
Cool. Thank you so very much for being with us. I really appreciate it. And I've dropped a number of things in the chat too, things that you referenced and things like that. So if people are looking, and I can certainly send them out to other people later. So thank you so much. A round of applause.
Yeah.
Thank you so very, very much. We are grateful.
Thank you.
And go check out the website, and you can look right around church and where you live. And so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Be
you.
well.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you very much.
Thanks. Great
Sure.
job. Thank you.
Bye-bye.